It's time to put your health in your own hands. Get ready to learn from today's top health and wellness innovators and thought leaders on Optimal Health Radio. Now, here's your host.
Hi, this is Tammy Patzer, and I'm really excited to introduce today's guest, Eileen Meagher. She is a gifted energy healer who connects people and animals with life force in nature to advance their health and well-being in order to prevent illness, help eliminate existing problems, and heal systemic toxicity. Eileen's healing abilities have been scientifically validated using cell-based and mouse models on overall health, quality of life, skin health, and vitamin D absorption. Welcome, Eileen.
Thank you, Pammy. Delighted to be here.
So today, Eileen, I've been reading your blog, and it's called, Do You Know That Shame Can Be Powerfully Transformative? And I'm really excited for you to talk about shame because of the nature of it, especially in Western culture or in the United States. Shame seems to have a very negative connotation. So I'm really anxious to hear about your take on shame and, of course, how can it be powerfully transformative? So tell me more about shame.
That is a strange title, isn't it? And I deliberately put that title on, I suppose, to get attention or to draw people's attention to it, because I think most people, especially in Western culture, feel that shame is a rather crippling aspect to have in one's personality. And indeed, in Western culture, the last thing that we want a child, for example, to feel is shame, because we think that will lead to an unhealthy self-concept, that we will experience guilt and low self-esteem and all that kind of thing. And of course, we think that in order to be successful and to have a fulfilling life, we simply cannot have shame. And most of the literature in the Western culture has really looked at shame as something very, very negative. Although we all admit, even Freud and Jung and those who have written about shame in very scholarly books, etc., they admit that there is such a thing as normal shame about small things. For example, I forgot to say hello to my grandmother when she came in. And we don't think of that shame as being part of the disease of unhealthy shame, that we can get over that rather quickly. And there are lots of, like a little child who maybe does something that the mother might not want him to do or her to do as a habit continually. For example, they might pull down their pants and expose themselves. And we say, oh no, we don't do that. But we don't consider that to be unhealthy shame, or that the child, as a result of that order by the mother or that advice by the mother, is going to, feel terribly shameful, unless, of course, the mother makes a huge deal of it and every time the child does anything wrong, hollers shame. But in Western culture, for example, we can take a look at what Freud said about shame. And while he does admit in his earlier work on the ego and the id that there is normal shame, the kind of normal shame that I mentioned, that most of the shame that he writes about is unhealthy shame. And Freud, he, of course, lived in the 19th century. I think he was born around the halfway through the 19th century, 1856, and then died in the early 20th century, in 1939. And he was born in the Czech Republic. And as we know, he is the author of, or the founder of, psychoanalysis. And his most famous book is The Ego and the Id. And he really emphasizes that unhealthy shame really comes from sexual activity when the child is young, when the child is scolded for being too sexual, when the child does acts that we might call almost sexual acts, that kind of activity on the part of shame, on the part of the child, will grow into unhealthy shame, and indeed into an adult that will have low self-esteem, that will tend to shy away from crowds, that will be very introverted, that will really not engage in healthy activities because he or she feels so shameful. So Freud really says that kind of shame has a corrosive effect on children and on adults if one has had that as a child. And again, what he really finds the core of shame to be in nudity and sexual activity, or nearly sexual activity, when one is a child. And then one grows up wanting to deny all that shame, but when in denying it, one increases it. And so that can become a real problem. Lately, though, we've had someone that a lot of people are really devoted to, and that's David R. Hawkins, who died recently. I think it was in 2018. And he has had a great following in seeking enlightenment. He's regarded as an enlightened master himself. He has an MD in psychiatry. He also has a PhD in philosophy. And he has written a number of books. And the most recent one, or actually the most famous one, is Power versus Force. And that is indeed a very, very enlightening book. Most people start out by reading that book, but they're quickly led to discovering his levels of consciousness. And he is famous for that. And people have really bought into that whole scale that he developed of consciousness. And he puts shame right at the bottom of that scale, from 0 to 50 or around there. He would say, that's where shame is. And then he moves on to guilt and low self-esteem, and on to higher, what he would call higher levels that bring you up to the scale of consciousness to about 700. And he finds that the highest people, or the most spiritual people, are probably at 700 to 800, right in there. People like Mother Teresa would be probably in the mid 700s. And I believe, because he knows a lot about kinesiology, he's somewhat of a master in kinesiology, that Christ's level of consciousness was in the 900s, probably close to 1,000. So it's very interesting that he makes a lot about shame, and the fact that he puts it at the lowest level of consciousness means he has very, very little regard for it. He says that someone at this level feels humiliated and has low self-esteem and is paranoid. And he says it's the product of a severely egocentric mind with the emotional and survival instincts of an animal. So a person's state of life at the lowest level of shame is really misery. So people are usually very, very unhappy if they're indeed experiencing a great deal of shame. Then Carl Jung, who was born in Switzerland and who passed on in 1961, he was born in 1875. Carl Jung talks about shame in a much more psychoanalytic method. He develops Freud's concepts of shame. And there is a researcher named Mark Jacobi who really develops the whole Jungian concept of shame and comes to a similar conclusion, that both shame and the lack of shame are really at the bottom of a host of personal problems. He has written a book on shame, and in the very first chapter, Phenomenology of Shame and Shame Anxiety, he says, as opposed to, let's say, David Hawkins, that there is an overlap between shame and guilt. So he says that guilt is the cause of shame, and he would put guilt on the lowest rung of Hawkins's levels of consciousness. What's very interesting in more recent years, we have people talking about this business of the corrosive result of shame and investigating, is that really true? So studies have been done on criminals and some studies have found that criminals have a great deal of self-esteem. They don't feel shame at all. And in fact, that helps them to stay safe, let's say, in a prison environment or whatever. And it can even help them to make a turnaround in their lives. And we know of stories of a lot of people who spent years in prison, have turned themselves around and have left prison, got their prison record expunged, and become very successful in life. In fact, I was reading yesterday, or saw on the TV yesterday, a young man, well, actually he was in his mid-30s, who had spent time in prison from the time he was 18. And he really turned himself around. And I don't remember exactly the name of the city, but now he is the mayor of a city. He turned himself around that much. So there are a lot of current articles on how shame can really help one to really turn one's life around. And there are lots of articles on people like criminals who simply do not lack self-esteem and don't have any shame. In fact, there's one article that talks about how shame helps one to survive in prison, that this lack of self-esteem, or this esteem, actually, self-esteem, instead of a lack of self-esteem, helps them to survive in prison. In fact, the people who appear to have low self-esteem are often victims of people who indeed have a great deal of self-esteem because they were able to get by with a lot of criminal activity. So that's a subject that's really been explored a lot by current scholars.
So with that really good background that you just gave us, is there such a thing as healthy shame? Can shame be healthy?
Is there, I asked the question in that blog, is there indeed a healthy form of shame? And there have been articles written about that. We have some books on that too. There are women with their doctorates, Miriam Adahan. She's written a number of books on domestic abuse, for example. And she argues in her main book, Shame and Unhealthy Shame, that if we're going to be healthy, mature adults, we have to experience some kind of shame for our mistakes in the past. Now, that kind of shame that one experiences is one that the person who feels it looks at it in a more healthy way, or finds help to look at it in a more healthy way. And instead of allowing it to be corrosive in their lives, it helps them to change their lives around. Somewhat like the criminals, some criminals who turn their lives around do when they're in prison, by the books that they read. They read extensively and begin to see that perhaps there's a way out of this. So we find people like Adahan promoting that in order to grow in maturity, the one to take full responsibility for the mistakes that they have made. And this habit of really taking responsibility for one's life can really turn one's life around. One gets educated, One looks at one's relationships, one looks at one's finances. In short, all of these aspects of our lives can lead to both healthy shame and unhealthy shame. We're told by some of these authors, and she is one, and another one is Sarah E. Bell, they say that we should embrace shame, that because of its power to help us to change our lives, we can really use it as a tool to advance in maturity, to advance in self-esteem, and to prevent a lot of problems from developing, problems like fear of intimate relationships, shyness, inability to achieve genuine happiness, and that kind of thing. That healthy shame, if one looks at it without delving into it and allowing oneself to feel the feelings of shame all over again, but looking at it somewhat objectively and saying, why did I do that? What led me to do that? And coming up with some answers to that, perhaps with the help of a psychotherapist or reading books or whatever, then the person can stop repeating the mistakes that brought about shame, and using that study of shame in their own lives to turn their lives around and to become more mature, to take responsibility for any mistakes that they may have made, even, the serious unhealthy shame, such as sex abuse, women, for example, who've allowed themselves or have experienced unhealthy relationships in a marriage. They can get out of that, and with help, they can turn the shame they feel in being caught in an unhealthy relationship, in admitting, that my husband really was someone who was very, very unhealthy and abused me a great deal. A lot of women don't like to admit they were abused, don't like to admit that they could ever have subjected themselves to abuse. And when they finally leave the abuser, or they're helped to leave the abuser, they can look at that as a learning tool. I will, not marry that kind of person again. What did I do myself to allow myself? What habits did I develop that allowed myself to be married to an abuser? Why did I not see that coming? And so on. So with the help of, let's say, a psychoanalyst, or by reading thoughtfully many books, or the advice of family members, they can begin to see that they are not themselves shamed and shameful because of that. They can look again at those the problems or the habits that led them into that, and again through self-assessment and self-analysis, decide that they are going to get out of that. And in fact, we see people who come out of, let's say, abused marriages go to the opposite extreme. And if they haven't really dealt with it carefully, they can enter another marriage and become abusers themselves. So it's very, very, very important that they get at the root cause of their shame and determine not to make the mistakes that they made in their shamed life, in feeling shame and so on. So it's interesting and it's helpful to know that there are lots of folks now, and I'm finding as I do the research, there are more women than men who are talking about, who have written books about healthy shame and how it can help advance one in maturity and so on. Men who are psychiatrists or psychotherapists, no doubt will help anyone who is experiencing shame to get over it. But the books, I find, have been written mainly by women. And that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Now, I know that you've done a lot of work with Guruji Mahendra Trivedi the author of the Trivedi Effect, and he talks a lot about shame and self-assessment. Can you explain a little bit more about what he says?
Yes, he often says that we should look directly at shame and find our way out of it by doing self-assessment or self-analysis. In fact, he suggests strongly, uses the Hindu word chintan for this exercise, that every evening one should spend 10 to 15 to 20 minutes looking over one's day. When one first starts this activity, self-assessment, he urges people to start looking back at the earliest experiences they've had of shame, their early childhood. Were they abused? What were they ashamed about? Are they now in their adulthood taking responsibility even for what they felt in childhood from the adult point of view, of course, because a child, comes to the stage of reason, we usually say around the age of 7, but sometimes they reach the age of reason 5, and they can know what is right and wrong and so on. And as they move into adulthood, they should begin to look back and say, well, I'm responsible for that happening. And when they begin to accept that they were responsible for the smaller items of shame, the smaller experiences, then they can advance into taking responsibility for larger pieces of shame that perhaps led them into self-abuse or abusing others, led them into criminal activity, led them into addictions and that kind of thing. That can be the ground of a lot of unhealthy shame. And with the practice of self-analysis in the evening that Mr. Mahendra Trivedi talks about, one is expected then to take full responsibility for anything that might have led one to abuse of any kind, to oneself or to others. So, and I can say that this activity of chintan, which he calls chintan, what we would call self-analysis or self-assessment, that everyone, and I think everyone, certainly including myself, look back and see, okay, have I taken full responsibility for my mistakes in the past? And I can say that I've not always done that for taking responsibility for my own actions. I have felt bad because I allowed myself to do this or to do that or to the other. And I know that I have allowed that to happen. And it's through study and through advice from people like Mr. Trivedi that I've been able to turn my life around and to not feel the shame and to use the experiences of shame as stepping stones to becoming much more mature, much more adult, much more happy in one's life. For example, I can say about myself that I used to often really think that struggle was something to be ashamed about. I shouldn't experience struggle, or I shouldn't fail, or I would chalk up my experiences of failure to shame or to lack of self-esteem. And actually, what we have found out, what we learn through more recent research, is that it's precisely failure and struggles and admitting them and looking them right in the eye, that can help one to turn one's life around and become more mature and become more adult in ways that would lead one to be more successful, to lead a more happy and fulfilled life, and certainly to be more abundant in every aspect of life. And then, in a way, doing that exercise helps us to eliminate the past, not to look at the future as an opportunity or as a trap for allowing oneself to feel more shame, but rather to live in the present moment and feel free in that present moment. So there's no shame lingering from the past, and there's no anticipation of shame in the future. So Mr. Mahendra Trivedi has been very, very helpful, I know, for me and for many, many others in taking full responsibility for the mistakes in one's life and using those opportunities to become successful in every aspect of life. So I know that I can say, having experienced what I have experienced personally and what a lot of people experience, is that, yes, healthy shame can lead to transformation. That transformation is turning one's life around, looking ahead with joy, with peace, with self-esteem, to one's day, to one's future. And that, of course, entails really negating the past, forgetting the past, because one has taken full responsibility for it and not allowed it to be the excuse for any unhappiness in the present or in the future. So I would say, yes, that healthy shame can lead to transformation.
So another thing with the shame and the healthy shame, you were talking earlier about shame being like at the lower consciousness, and that was from several of these different authors that you mentioned, that shame was like the lowest of low in the consciousness level. So in this process of Chintan and self-evaluation, does it obviously, as you look at the past and you're looking at, you really become living in the now, because you're not anticipating bad stuff that's going to happen either. So you're living in the now. So does that help to raise your consciousness level?
Yes. And if one looks seriously at David Hawkins' work on the levels of consciousness, well, it's very interesting, although Freud and Jung subsequently disputed the claim that shame was at the lowest level, but they would say that maybe guilt is at the lowest level, and then lack of self-esteem, and then shame, and then anger, and hatred, and then anger, and it just climbs higher and higher and higher. So by the time one gets to 500 or 600, one has really cleaned up one deck pretty well, and one is really, as you say, forgetting the past, not allowing it to determine to live our lives in the present, and are not anticipate the mistakes we've made in the past to occur in the future. So, yes, although there's disagreement among people like Freud and Jung about to the extent of how shame can hurt us, they tend to say that actually it's guilt and then lack of self-esteem. But then one can argue about that. Not that one has to agree with David Hawkins that shame is at the lowest level, but what we find in the work of the scholars, especially Freud and Jung, and more recent scholars, is that those items, shame, guilt, self-esteem, and buried anger, that you can really say one or the other is at the lowest level. But they're all intertwined so much and so part of a kind of general disease of self-reproach that it's hard to pin down, and nobody has been able to pin down exactly which one is at the lowest level and exactly which one comes next, and next. In fact, Dr. John Sarno, who wrote an excellent book, a big scholar, he was the head of orthopedic surgery at a major New York City hospital. And he claims in his book, The Healing of Back Pain and then the Mind The Mind-Body Syndrome, published in 1998, I believe, he claims that it's really corrosive anger that is buried deep within one's experiences, within one's life, and has become unconscious, that is really at the heart of our problems, our lack of self-esteem, the pain that we begin to experience in different parts of the body, and so on. Now, David Hawkins doesn't get into, although he's a psychiatrist and so on, he doesn't get into the physical symptoms much. But Sarno, a much more recent author, does indeed get into that. And his work has spawned a lot of subsequent books on this whole business of the effect of low self-esteem, anger, guilt, all of that, on one's overall health, mind, body, and spirit. So it's a very, very interesting topic to explore. And as I said before, no one seems to have the absolute answer. But if one, for example, feels constant low back pain, that one can really do a self-assessment, begin to look at what mistakes one has made, what one really thinks of oneself with low self-esteem, the anger one has experienced, really looks at all of that and turns one's life around, and to see that one is really with repressed anger, that one is really angry at oneself, and one can say that anger at oneself is really the result of what Freud would say is shame over nudity and sexual activity in one's childhood. So it's very interesting to see how that topic of shame has come to be explored in the research literature, and that more people are saying now, coming to the conclusion, having researched unhealthy shame, having researched healthy shame, or what some of the more recent authors have said, that the healthy shame is something that you grow into, and they start with very, very simple examples, rather than going deeply, as Freud and Jung did, into unhealthy shame. They say, well, they tend to make more light of it. And I think that's a reaction to how much negativity both Freud and Jung attached to shame in their works. The more recent works make more light of it in a way. But listening Trivedi, Guruji, he does see it as a real problem. And he sees it mainly as a problem of not admitting and taking responsibility for having made the mistakes one has made in one's life. He really talks about self-blame being so important to turning one's life around, not blaming others, not making excuses for one's past. Rather, right now, taking full responsibility for one's mistakes, whatever they have been, refusing to blame others, refusing to get angry about them, refusing to use them as excuses for diseases in the body, so to speak. That's what's important to advancing in enlightenment, to advancing in maturity, to advancing finally toward transformation. But there are a lot of steps involved there. Now, some people, and there are examples of these, some people make a quick turnaround. When Arno gives lots of examples of doctors, for example, who refuse to take drugs for their own mistakes, and the corrosive effects of those, the effects of those mistakes. When they don't want to take the drugs, although they might prescribe them to someone else who comes into the office and says, oh, I have this problem, I can't sleep because of this, or I have a pain in my back because of this, or a pain in my knee, or whatever. Sarno says some of these doctors, because they've listened to a lot and they've observed a lot, very quickly follow Sarno's advice and turn it around. In fact, Sarno himself was suffering from a lot of migraine headaches. And one day when he was leading a meeting with other doctors, he felt a migraine headache coming on. And he said to one of his colleagues, I'm beginning to get a terrible headache. And this doctor, who hadn't studied all of this, as far as we know, said to him, do you get angry a lot? Do you feel some anger? Well, Dr. Sarno was really puzzled by that comment. So he went into his office, shut the door, and spent about 15 minutes looking at himself in this moment and saying, what am I feeling in this moment? And he began to realize that he was angry over some comments made by some of his colleagues in the meeting. He was feeling some shame over some things he had said. He was feeling guilt and all the rest of it. And began to see this relationship between what he was feeling in his head and what he had experienced emotionally in the meeting. So he began to think a whole lot more about that, and he developed a lot of helpful activities for overcoming problems in the body that he felt were due to not breaking a leg, but due to shame one felt, guilt one felt, and mistakes one had made, and feeling bad about that, low self-esteem, feeling this buried anger, and then how to bring that to the surface and turn it around. And as I said, he talks about people who made very quick turnarounds, but some other people had made very slow turnarounds, and he advised those people who came to him for treatment, he advised them to see a psychotherapist or whatever. He would just simply call to their attention that there was a relationship between their current experiences and their buried shame, their delusions, their lack of self-esteem, and so on. Now, I don't know how much more recent authors of books on healthy shame, really, like the ones that I have read, have not credited Sarno with the work that he has done. But a lot of people have credited him, and a lot of psychotherapists credit him with helping people tremendously to turn around and lead more healthy lives. Guruji himself simply says, you have to take responsibility for your past. For example, you may have been beaten by your parents. You may have low self-esteem as a result of that. You may have anger as a result of that. But you stop dwelling on that. You don't allow it to interfere with how you behave in this present moment. So that's what his self-analysis and self-assessment is about. And notice that he advises people to do it every single day. Because people can go to a psychotherapist and they'll work on it for a while, and then when the psychotherapist dismisses them, they find themselves falling back into old habits. Maybe every 3 weeks or every month, they will think about taking responsibility. But Guruji says, no, every day you must do it. You must transform yourself. You must make a very deliberate turnaround as you examine your day and the mistakes you feel you have made, take responsibility for them, and determine that you won't make those mistakes again. And then feel happy in the process. Hey, I did better today than I did yesterday. And some people, again, can turn around very quickly, lead to transformation very quickly, and others it may take a year, 2 years, many years before they find themselves really happy, really successful, really abundant in every area of their lives. Of course, with the help of the energy that he transmits, the energy that we call now the Trivedi effect.
Yes. So Eileen, if somebody wants to connect with you and learn more about you and how you help people and work with people, where can they get that information?
Well, they can get it on my website, eileenmeagher.com. And they'll see my email address on there, and they'll see a phone number on there that they can call.
Okay.
But I have found, and the people that I have worked with, Tammy, that I can use all that Guruji has taught us, and then I can go back into, if the person is simply having a very, very difficult time admitting anything, I'd say, well, she beat me, or he never liked me, or all this kind of thing. I can go back through the research that I have done and see the wisdom of Guruji's teaching. I can go back to what I've read of Dr. Sarno's work, and of course what I've read in the subsequent books that have followed the major books of Freud and Jung. I can find myself, although I am not an ordained, quote unquote, a degreed psychotherapist, I can help people a great deal, and I don't pretend to be a psychotherapist, but I find I call it holistic healing. I look at their entire lives and what they're willing to tell me, and what I suspect just from what they tell me. I ask them questions, and I bring them to the point of saying, well, don't you have any responsibility for this? And I give examples of, for example, if a husband and wife are having a problem, I say, okay, he said this to you, how did you respond? And they say, well, I sulked and all the rest of it. And then how did he respond to your sulking? Well, he just got worse. How can we break this? How can we stop this? So we have to, if he says something abusive to me, why do I have to take it into myself and abuse him back? He is responsible for the way he behaves. I am responsible for the way I behave. So I can't blame him for my responses. And he can't blame me for my response. He has to blame himself or look at his mistakes. I have to look at my mistakes, not blame him for my mistake, and vice versa. So yes, the Trivedi effect, with the power of the Trivedi effect, one can move quickly and over time to the point where one is not blaming oneself or blaming others for one's mistakes, for one's maturity or immaturity or whatever, that energy can help one to turn around very quickly and become the happy, peaceful, and even joyful person one has always wanted to be. Forgetting the past. Living one's day, as you said, in the now, hour by hour. And at the end of the day, doing that self-assessment, which will help one to live the next day even more productively.
Well, thank you so much, Eileen. I think we learned a lot. And we do have another interview where we did discuss Dr. Sarno's work in a lot more detail. So everyone, if you're interested in that, you'll be able to find that also. So be sure that you go to eileenmeagher.com, and you'll find Eileen has a lot of really good research blogs there. And I do have some other interviews that you'll be able to find also with Eileen. So thank you so much for sharing about shame and how it can be so powerfully transformative.
Thank you, Tammy. It's an ongoing personal interest of mine to keep up to speed on what's being researched about these emotions, which have so much to do with how we live.
Yeah, it is very interesting because sometimes I don't think we think a lot about specific feelings or even what our feelings are to give them a name, such as guilt or shame or anger. And a lot of times I think we're confused about what that feeling is. Yes. And sometimes we mistake let's say something for shame or shame for something else. So like you said, it's well worth that daily look of looking at your life and taking responsibility for everything. So again, thank you. I really appreciate it. Everyone, this is Tammy Patzer. Go make it a beautiful day.
You've been listening to today's top health and wellness innovators and thought leaders on Optimal Health Radio. To get more solid health and wellness information, visit OptimalHealthRadio.com.